All right, well, I'm going to get started. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We'll just wait. I know some people are still joining, but we'll get through our little introduction. We are really excited to be here today to share with all of you some lessons learned and observations on how museum projects are impacted by one of its very first steps, the setting of a realistic target budget. An inappropriate or unrealistic budget can really hobble a project. Innovative design can become a fantasy. So, how do we hone in on reality? Here is something we can all say. No one wants their project to be over budget, and unanticipated and surprise costs that lead to being over budget, time is money, usually delays the schedule as well. So we'll get going with this just as an introduction. This is brought to you by Praxis Museum Projects Group, and these are the members. And Praxis, we are here to add to our collective knowledge about creating museums. We are members of the Praxis Museum Project Group. And Praxis is an industry nonprofit network of museum professionals. Each of us brings a particular expertise to the process of creating museums, exhibitions, and cultural experiences of all types. Our goal is to learn from each other and extend that to our collaboration with clients in the museum field as a whole. I am Carolynne Harris. I am principal of Carolynne Harris Consulting. We are a museum planning firm that specializes in capital projects in all stages of development, from early visioning to building teams and implementation to operational assessment and final implementation and opening. Today, we want to speak about 40 minutes and then have a bit of time to answer any questions. Please, if you're not already muted, mute yourself. We will also please put questions in the chat and we will have time to answer those questions at the end. Our presenters will introduce themselves in a moment, but the full bios of all of us can be found on the Praxis Museum Projects Group website. Some of you may remember our previous webinars on a similar topic. This is fresh data from recently delivered projects. So we are excited to bring this to you to update some of the things that we have been discussing over the years. And we also recognize that we're in a moment of uncertainty. So we hope to help mitigate some of that uncertainty, but also with a practical eye, knowing that there is uncertainty. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Kris and Cathlin.
Thanks, Carolyn. My name is Kris Collins. I'm Managing Director of the Cultural Projects Sector Group at MGAC. We are a project management and owners representative firm working in the UK and all of North America. So thank you for having us today. Just one thing that's interesting, you'll see the symbol on the right side of the screen. It's a term called the center of effort. It's sailing terminology, recognizing that you can't control the wind, but you can control where you point your sails to achieve the maximum effort to push your boat through the water. Having a target to aim at is helpful in lots of life situations. This topic of target budgets has been an ongoing discussion topic among many museum professionals in the museum service provider network. We often hear that clients sometimes expect extraordinary results, but set unrealistic budgets. Setting a realistic budget is very difficult to do. Online sources are unhelpful and worse, misleading. If you Google, how much should a museum cost? AI Google, in its wisdom, says construction should cost between $150 to $550 a square foot for a new museum construction and $75 to $550 a square foot for new exhibits. Sorry, Google, this data is wrong. A lot of published budgets averages are quite out of date, not properly adjusted for crazy pandemic inflation, and have been slow to keep up with new visions of what museums are and what exhibitions do best to engage their audiences. In order to serve the field, we again formally polled our professional networks, including some of our own projects that have either been completed in the last 3 to 4 years or currently in development. Because of the unprecedented inflation in 2020 through 2022, we pulled out projects completed before 2022. We also pulled out a couple projects that were bid pre-pandemic because the contracted amounts were infected by COVID. Haha. A few minutes ago, in a few minutes, we'll give a few notes on the current market conditions and actually share project costs based on the survey. But first, we'll provide our best view on really best practices of developing a target budget. We will talk about the entire museum project budget, not just exhibitions. And it's our desire that through research and conversations like this, we can provide newly accessible and accurate budget guidelines for the museum industry. So today we're tackling the target budget because there's so much to consider. Over many years of doing project-based work, the end of a project offers a chance to learn from the experience. And we like to ask key stakeholders to peek back at the initial project plan and honestly ask, number one, how did the eventual final costs compare to the initial target budget? Number two, at the beginning, did the project set up enduring guardrails surrounding the budgets and the components of the budgets? And number three, what horrifying things happened along the way that we should have done differently? One of the biggest problems we have collectively seen in the industry is that owners start projects with an unrealistic budget that leaves out critical costs that should have been considered. Owners often say that sticking to the budget's important, but their behaviors sometimes show they want what they want, and they're willing to increase budgets or ignore escalating costs as the design evolves. Owners are the ones who get to declare the budget, hopefully with some help from outside parties. However, when faced with a decision to increase that budget to cover unexpected costs, owners are the ones who have to ask themselves, should the museum just plan to fundraise more? Is there capacity for increased donations? Is there a risk of cratering trust with previous donors that committed to a different target budget? Today, we'll explore an idealized method for establishing a target budget, tricks for keeping on track, and some suggestions for those who are tasked with creating a project plan and approving those target budgets.
Well, and thank you again for joining us. I'm Cathlin Bradley. I'll be sharing this panel with Kris. I'm VP of Partnership Strategy at Kubik Maltbie. We're an exhibit fabricator working in the US, Canada, and Europe. I've been in the industry over 20 years, and over that time, I've held roles in lots of different museums as well as the firms that serve them. And I've learned a lot about planning and execution. So ways to drive success and then pitfalls we all hope to avoid. So as you see on your screen, this is a bit of a horror story. This is an actual published story for a major museum project. $200 million budget balloons to $400 million before being scrapped. So definitely something we want to avoid. This is definitely an extreme case, but over the past 5 years, we've seen some crazy things happening with project budgets, with escalation on top of typical inflation. And when we don't plan properly, things can go sideways quickly. So today we'll talk about how to be proactive with our plans and account for the real economic situations we're facing to avoid common mistakes when working on capital projects.
So for today, we've prepared 9 significant items to keep an eye on early in the project goal setting and budget setting period. We will give you 9 things not to do, and the importance of this good advice will be obvious. We have stepped into projects underway in design and even under construction, and we've seen all these bad things that can have fatal effects on a project. So remember, failure, even if it's not your failure, presents a learning opportunity. So, number 1, please don't skip the feasibility study. I'm going to talk about this for a minute. It's really important. Projects are essentially business propositions. And we notice that owners and design professionals often charge ahead into the design phase without knowing the project goals. These are all basic questions that a feasibility study can and should answer at the conceptual level to set a project out on the right path. Now, keep in mind, there is an ideal sequence for the design process. In the feasibility study, you need to establish the necessary program of needs, which is in square feet, establish a target budget, establish an expected schedule, and confirm that you have the fundraising capacity for that budget based on the schedule. Then you can have your design team start their design work based on these goals. A feasibility study is a relatively short period, and the results of rushing into a design phase without a clear plan will result in a floating budget. kind of think like a tidal wave. That's no good. Museums, donors, stakeholders obviously don't like that. So a feasibility study could also mean visitor surveys, really asking why you're doing a project as opposed to what it will cost. Establishing a realistic initial budget is really a high value. It has the most impact early in a project. Your ability to effectively make a design change really diminishes with time. Early concept design changes are easy to make, whereas once the technical construction drawings are complete, any change costs time and money. So it's really important to establish those things early on. A feasibility study should also include an economic study to understand the market conditions, benchmark expected visitation compared to the peer institutions, study target audience that will come, and prepare an operating revenue model. Also discuss an operating endowment. Many museums have those that kind of smooth out the bumps of the first few years. So number two, don't forget to benchmark or compare your planned project to the marketplace. We're fortunate to be part of a community of professionals who are fairly open to sharing information and experiences for the benefit of the industry. When you begin the planning process, do your research, and part of that should be speaking to similar institutions about what they have been spending on renovations and new construction. So hard costs are the largest part of a project budget. These are the construction, infrastructure, exhibit fabrication, AV hardware, and media production. See the dashed yellow lines that surround the two hard cost categories in black and pink. Black is for construction and infrastructure. Pink is for exhibit fabrication, AV hardware, exhibit lighting, and media production. Rightfully so, hard costs are the majority of a project budget. So let's do a comparison of new construction versus renovating an existing building. The left graphic shows a budget for new construction. Right graphic shows a budget for renovating an existing building. In our analysis, we observe where clients are creating a new museum building as a percentage of the hard cost of the budget. Let's say you want to spend $20 million on a total project budget. The percentage of hard costs in the exhibit budget, pink, is half of what it would be in a renovation project. This makes logical sense to everyone, right? That if you're going to build a new museum, the new building construction would cost more relative to the total budget. Again, this is average, but it's surprising to me how many clients are still thinking that a museum should be put into a brand new building compared to renovating an existing property that has major features like increased floor-to-floor heights and necessary movement, vertical circulation, things like that that are already there for the building. Now, it's not always less if you're going to repurpose an existing building. If you're moving structural bays, adding new elevators, stairs, or reskinning the building, the expected costs depend on the market and how you're renovating the property. You should also consider operating and life cycle costs, separate but important to the benchmark at a conceptual level. A building with glass, like a glass building, is going to have very little insulation. You're going to have much higher utility bills and unwanted natural light. And, exhibits and artifacts want stable temperature and humidity and relatively low environment.
Just to note, this is generally the case in the industry that a new build is going to be more expensive than renovation. However, there are things that we need to think about when we're considering a renovation versus new build. Sometimes an existing building simply just doesn't meet the needs of the museum, or renovation costs could be much higher due to deferred maintenance or other issues, like Kris mentioned, adding an elevator, reskinning a building. There are certainly things to consider. Our buildings may be too big to serve the needs of the museum. The next slide will get into that a little bit more.
So regarding an existing building, you have to pay attention to its conditions and what will be involved to prepare those new exhibits. Existing buildings often have long-term deferred maintenance needs. Ignoring those deferred maintenance conditions will cause an increase of at least 10 to 20% or more. So it's really good to have a physical condition assessment done by an outside company before doing any design work. It's shocking to us that when clients buy an existing building for renovation or plan to renovate a building of their own, that they haven't thought about the end of the useful life for systems in their building that are existing. With construction infrastructure being such a large part of any project budget, it's critical to know what you have. If it's just infrastructure upgrades needed for new exhibits in an existing building, that's still a huge unknown that needs just a little engineering study before establishing a target budget. Just don't ignore it. Building sites also have major impacts on budgets and schedule. Soil, underground utilities, zoning, public review boards, parking, city zoning, all those things are good to study early and make sure you have that in your plan. You also should consider deinstalling and reusing casework, art installations, exhibits, and other installations likely to have hidden costs to deinstall, put in storage, conserve, reinstall, all those things. You may have special things in your collection that really impact the cost and plan. You might have
Yeah, and
all, oh, go ahead.
that's all right, Chris.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, just make sure you consult your operations team. So if you have an existing museum, consult your maintenance team and the exhibit staff that maintains the exhibits, the people who maintain the building, because they'll have a full understanding of the existing conditions that others may not. They'll have valuable insight into what's going on behind the scenes, what works, what doesn't, any pain points that should be avoided either with a new building or with a renovation. So in line with that, using your knowledge to figure out the conditions you have, also don't set the budget without project team engagement. So what does this mean? Like every project is going to start with a team. A typical museum project involves a number of key players. That might include an architect, a general contractor, an exhibits designer, media producer, an exhibit fabricator, among others. These different team members each bring a unique expertise that they can contribute to the planning process, especially developing that conceptual budget. They have an idea of what's being spent in those different disciplines across the industry. So it's generally accepted that within the industry, designers design to an established target budget. So in order to ensure that the approved design intent aligns with that established target budget, again, you need to engage those key players early. This means the owners need to have very direct conversations about the budget and get buy-in to that budget. If your trusted partners are telling you the budget is unrealistic, it's better to discuss that early before the pencil hits the paper, so adjustments can be made in the expectations for the project. So plan for collaboration between your partners who will deliver the project, even if they're under separate contracts. As much as project success depends on the individual expertise, it really, really benefits from collaboration between those key players. And having those voices at the table can identify any budget misalignment, scope gaps that may come back to bite you in the end, long lead items that may drag on a project schedule, and then other concerns that could end up costing time and money. So it's especially helpful to have the architects and exhibit designers collaborate from the beginning. We often see museums hire an architect before really understanding the museum's exhibit program. So, which leaves the designer to try and fit the exhibits into a space that may not meet the needs of the exhibit's big idea or the plan. This often results in buildings being redesigned or modified to accommodate the exhibits. So this can actually end up dragging out timelines. This can also cost money as things are adjusted. So it's better to have both of those players involved from the beginning. It's also really useful to have your exhibit fabricator or an independent cost estimator at the table as early as concept design. So for a relatively small fee, they can evaluate the budget at every phase of design to see as it develops how it's aligning with the target. So we can actually make adjustments as we refine the design rather than waiting for the project to be bid out, inevitably probably coming in over budget, and then value engineering. So this redesign costs money, it's disheartening. It also takes away from the production timeline. So be sure to have your team engaged from the beginning.
So related to that, we often step into projects where the design team is already established, and sometimes people who are unfamiliar with experienced museums, not art museums, but like history museum, science museum, things like that, They might be given misguided advice and where they think they should have one throat to choke on all design matters, meaning the exhibit designer should contract under the architect. So yes, if you do have one contract, it's true that writing that one contract and holding one party accountable for everything could have some legal benefits. You don't have to worry about the coordination between the parties for infrastructure planning, visitor flow, or do you? So here are the reasons why we prefer this diagrammatic relationship, showing separate contracts for each, the architect and the exhibit designer. Now, the first one is transparency of process. Owners should really know what's being discussed. I'm not a fan of having filtered conduit between an owner and exhibit designer. That's just me. I'd rather have that be a direct relationship where they have very transparent communication. Now, I'm formerly a practicing architect. We're trained to control the process and outcome, but efficiency also drives quick decisions sometimes and minimizes the unknowns, like ignoring them. And that's not good. Not that every architect does that, but the truth is exhibit design is messy. It always takes longer for early design phases, and it's always out of sequence with the building design. It's really better to have an open process of coordination between the architect and the exhibit designer. And just keep in mind again that basically the simple theory that the architect draws what the general contractor is going to build, and the exhibit designer draws what the exhibit fabricator will build. Those are four prime contracts in an experienced museum that we think results in the best projects. The other thing is the general contractor is usually done first with the gallery spaces, and then the fabricator comes on board. So it's just another out of sequence thing that happens in museum projects.
And so to go back to the team, don't forget about the museum staff. Plan for input. They are an incredibly valuable resource. Just like in planning for your building, they know things that work in the building, things that don't. So as you hire your external partners, don't forget to engage that internal team. Like your external partners, each of those team members has their unique expertise and experience perspectives that can contribute to a really successful project. So having worked on staff for a museum, I can tell you, your staff is incredibly valuable to setting goals, establishing the program, and considering how to allocate the budget based on what they've seen in their time working in the exhibits. So while upper management voices are certainly important, you can learn a lot from other staff. So think about including staff like collection staff. They have a deep understanding of the objects and artifacts that are going to be featured in the exhibit and the different unique requirements of those artifacts for display. They know the fun facts, they know the intriguing stories that visitors want to hear that should be part of that exhibit program. Team members who interact with visitors may be able to share great insights on traffic flow, favorite types of experiences, those that are expensive and maybe less engaging. They know where the bottlenecks are in the flow of the galleries. They know what collects dust from disuse, but they can also provide data on expenses related to consumables, programs that should be considered, and then operating budget and a staffing plan. Education staff, on the other hand, has a great understanding of grade level requirements to book field trips. They also know how to work with large groups and how they engage in the exhibit spaces, as well as special programs that can be developed around different collections. Their input is incredibly valuable for institutions who depend on school groups for a portion of their annual revenue. And certainly don't forget about the people who maintain the building and exhibits. They know what's really expensive to repair, what's impossible to clean, and generally everything that's gone wrong with the exhibits. So consult them to not make the same mistakes twice. They can also provide data on expenses related to ongoing maintenance that should be considered in the operating budget as you plan. So this is tricky, but be very cautious of donor input. While every team member has a unique set of interests, and certainly different departments do, donor interests may be more personal than practical. And finally, just remember for those existing museums, staff will be effectively doing two jobs during the project. So plan for who's responsible for specific duties related to the development of your new exhibits. Also be aware of burnout, delays, scheduling meetings, and gathering feedback from folks who are typically running ongoing exhibits. And so next, number 6, don't pinch pennies up front, make the investment. So spending money to prepare a work plan is absolutely vital. While some clients are hesitant to spend money up front on soft costs, it helps you articulate to donors and stakeholders exactly what you're doing and why. And that's critical to establish the credibility. And like Kris said, early on in this presentation, this is essentially presenting a business plan. So there are benefits for having a separate planning team up front. This is something we see very often versus selecting a team to run the entire project. As you all know, fundraising takes time, and often when we take a pause in the development process for fundraising, we learn things that could inform the direction and potentially change the project. So in this initial phase, it's okay to consider this planning team as a limited scope or duration for this project. It's a good thing for clients. If it's not working out or a task is complete, clients can decide that there are other ways they want to spend their money, or they may want to pursue different relationships. So another thing to consider is, again, making that investment in professional cost estimating. Because at the end of the day, when you're going into a bid situation and your budget is aligning with your bids, there's a lot less work that's happening once you make that award. Value engineering after bidding gets you cents on the dollar. So you're making cuts, there's often redesign happening, and it's just generally doesn't create great feelings at the onset of a project. So last point on pinching pennies, this is a universal truth. I've seen it as a person working in a museum. Beware of low-cost proposals. If it seems too good to be true, it probably is.
Great. So I will say what we get to do is fun, really. And one of the things that we get to see is moving on from the phase might not be as much fun when you're getting out of the concepting phase. But when the concept and design are on target and approved, you should leave them alone, right? Just keep going and build on what you have. So this is really a lesson in leadership. Don't forget that you are a leader. This is very difficult for owners. As a leader of a museum project, museum owners have to lead. Help your entire team to understand that building a museum is a series of yeses and approvals that build on each other. When you started a project, you created a series of clear goals and objectives, right? That is the work of why you have the project. That's the most vital part. So your team needs some leadership toward the end goals and objectives. Keep those goals handy. Make sure everyone is aligned with them. Review them as various design stages come along, and make sure that your focus is consistent. This is hard because your staff all have day jobs. And the other thing is project governance is really crucial. While you make sure that all your partners share the same vision, also make sure they're clear on how design approvals and budget revisions will be handled and who is responsible for those approvals. What we recommend is that on-staff leadership is responsible for day-to-day decisions, while building committees are there for guidance, not decisions, and the board should support major initiatives and cost expenditures, be aware of design progress, and focus on supporting the fundraising effort. All this said does not mean that you ignore all the new ideas. Just keep asking yourself, does this direction tie to our original goal and objectives? So if a new idea pops up and if it is not pointing to the big question of why you're doing it, then don't do it. Stay true to your focus. And we all know that redesign costs money later and possibly time. So, and we can ask, what could go wrong? How about a project, for instance, that could have 50% cost increases in change orders due to owner-driven design changes, surprise field conditions, uncoordinated drawings? Projects are hard enough, so decisions need to be strategic early on and become more tactical as the design evolves into the details. So don't assemble a partial budget. Even when you're doing a conceptual budget, you should try to take in a full view of the project-related costs. One thing that's helpful is to consider a very detailed checklist of what could be spent on a project and think through what budget categories would apply. What you see here are the major categories where you could spend money. Keep in mind that there are plenty of hidden costs that will come back to haunt you if you don't get them on your list during the planning stages. These can be site and building issues, like who's paying for gallery lighting, new lighting controls. Does the exhibit lighting package include in-case lighting and special effects? Or they could be exhibit related, like, what do you mean you thought the museum was handling artifact mounting? We assumed it was part of your bid. Just remember, if you think you've thought of everything, think again and again. These are major budget categories should be planned for and managed throughout a process. And at MGAC, we actually have developed a worksheet over the years that is really a checklist of all those things. It's been very helpful for us. The next one, okay, so this is getting to the meat of the what are things costing, right? Don't forget to consider market conditions, inflation, and build it into the owner's contingency and track it. So we have a few slides on this important topic, but let's start with owner's contingency. Most people and museums don't have unlimited funds, so they have to have insurance. That's what a contingency is, money set aside to cover potential errors, omissions, disasters. Look at what inflation did in the last few years. A contingency may be able to help your project recover from an unexpected event like that. Of course, budget forecasts should always take known market conditions and a realistic schedule into account. We'll talk about that today. Professional cost estimators always include what's referred to as a design contingency in budget estimates. Now, this is intended to cover early unknowns, misinterpretations, and later unexpected price hikes, surprises on the site, and basically for things that aren't drawn yet. It starts out high, usually 15% during concept and schematic, and as designs and documents are fleshed out, the percent drops, but only goes away when we have hard bids and contracted pricing, when you lock them down, or as we say, retire the risk. There are always hidden conditions and other things to consider that will evolve over the project. Now, that was design contingency. An owner's contingency is different. And this is a separate fund, also a percentage of the budget, starts out high and decreases as the project moves past early pitfalls, site flaws, building delays. You never know, right? But it never disappears until the project is concluded. Now, we plan to protect the owner's contingency from being spent, but there are always items that do come up, and owners are glad they have this fund standing by. The owner's contingency is not a slush fund to dip into for enhancements or changes or enhancements or new ideas. If there's anything left, you can apply it to those items you wished for it but didn't get. But like the budget, the owner's contingency needs to be monitored and revisited on a regular basis during a project. So related to this topic is don't ignore inflation. A common problem is that clients don't consider the reduction in buying power as time marches on. This is a common problem and has been exacerbated in the last few years. Our internal cost consulting team has been tracking escalation in this industry over the years, and I want to illustrate the impact of cumulative escalation over time. So looking at this chart, the left vertical axis shows historic and factual annual inflation in building costs, whereas the right vertical axis shows the cumulative inflation over time. The data labels on the orange line represent the cumulative escalation from the beginning of 2019 to that respective year. As you can see, between 2019 and 2024, the cumulative inflation was 44%. And the forecasted inflation for this year is 5.5% with all of the tariff nonsense and just generally what's happening in the market. That's a significant number, especially when being applied to millions of dollars. So $100,000 of construction in 2019 costs $152,000 today. Okay, so this is likely the darkest point in our discussion today and mind-blowing, and I'm sorry. I just want to give an example of the escalation data from the prior slides, because this is, again, reality. And I'd like to illustrate its impact on a project. We know of a real client planning a museum for the last 5 years. In 2019, That museum and their board approved a total project budget of $76 million. Now, that was projected for, nominal inflation of 3%. There are numerous delays which continue to push the start date back. So if we applied the 44% escalation to the 2019 budget, you can see the overall project budget increases by almost $34 million. This was for a 53,000 square foot museum building. Looking at this data more closely, the exhibit fabricator costs per square foot increased from $700 to $1,000 a square foot. That's just what inflation does.
Yeah, so I get asked at least once a week, why is it so expensive to build exhibits? I think from Kris's previous slides, you're probably getting the picture. But really, it just comes down to the materials required for the construction of buildings and exhibits. At Kubik Maltbie, we've been tracking the most common construction products. It's easy to track things like sheet goods. And we've been tracking that since the onset of COVID in 2020 through today. And as you can see, we've had some substantial increases in key categories. Over time, some materials prices have come back down, which is great news. When supply is catching up with demand is decreasing. There are a lot of market factors, but for the most part, they won't reach pre-COVID levels. So you can see here, things like hardware are still up over 100% of what they were pre-COVID. Whereas we're seeing things happening with sheet goods and other materials reducing, but with upcoming tariffs, this may change. So you can see a comparison here of the commodity goods inflation versus escalation. So the chart shows the average inflation, the average percent increase for each category over the past 5 years since the onset of COVID in 2020. Whereas the bar on the right, the green bar, shows what typical inflation should be. So this is inflation versus the escalation on these unique products. So the difference is inflation is something that's impacting an entire marketplace, where escalation impacts specific goods and services uniquely depending on what's happening in those specific sectors. So even during the recession, there is some amount of inflation. So think of inflation as basically a cost of living increase. If inflation is below zero, the market is in major trouble. So we're always going to see that. But as you can see, the cumulative inflation for the majority of materials tracks with what Kris is seeing for cumulative inflation across the marketplace, and where we've landed in 2025 being probably about 5% inflation.
So here's a graphic that shows a sample $20 million project budget from conceptual design on the left to actual construction on the right. Now we're talking about the owner's contingency again. Notice the red sliver at the bottom, that's contingency. So it gets smaller from left to right, but the same $20 million remains the same. This is a happy project. You started off, you said it's going to be $20 million, and wow, we saved it. It's $20 million at the end. So that's a good diagram. Here's Cathlin with some reality checks.
Yeah, so just to echo Kris, the idea is that the project budget doesn't change. That contingency is simply a buffer allocated by the owner to cover those unexpected costs and changes that arise during a construction project. So especially those outside of the contractor's scope of work or changes in the marketplace that can't be controlled. So it acts as a safeguard against those unforeseen circumstances and should be built into the budget. And again, remember, it decreases as you get to the end of construction because it's being used.
So how much should a museum cost? We've talked about what not to do. Let's talk about how to establish a realistic budget. So breaking the overall budget into partitioned categories is a best practice. With these budget sections, you can prepare an estimate for each section based on benchmarking. So here's how I develop a museum conceptual budget by major categories. Remember, this budget is established before anything is designed, like at all. It's all based on the program. So exhibit fabrication, exhibit lighting, and AV hardware can all be conceived as dollars per square foot. But consider levels of graphics, technology, media, casework, artifacts, and so on. Do some benchmarking studies first to inform your target goals and also consider what your competitors are doing. Media production, software, short films, interactive media is based on the expectations of technology and interactive media, often calculated as a percentage of the exhibit budget up front. Think twice before saying your museum will have state-of-the-art media experiences, unless you have the money to back it up. People say that all the time, and then they have a Chevy budget. Museums are becoming more reliant on technology, and procuring museum producers is a tricky part of the business. That's another seminar. In my opinion, we consider museum media production as part of the exhibit cost because it is so integral. Now, renovation and construction infrastructure costs can be based off dollars per square foot and the expected scope of work. A good cost estimator can develop a conceptual estimate quickly, and it's an affordable, high-value item. Even if you're just doing an exhibit renovation project, infrastructure costs are not to be ignored or faked. Infrastructure reaches the end of its useful life all the time. What a perfect time to get updated is in your exhibits project. Now, other costs need special attention by going through a budget checklist to ballpark those costs. Site improvements, legal, fixture, furniture, and equipment, those can all be ballparked at dollars per square foot based on the program. Owner's contingency, we've talked about, usually 15%. And soft costs, we'll talk about in the next slide. So let's talk about soft costs. These are usually anywhere from 15 to 25% of your budget is a rule of thumb for an average. This would not include media producer costs, which should be considered part of the exhibit budget. So what are soft costs? These are soft costs paid for services and not materials or construction or technology. However, they can be considered for some cases. Some ask if exhibit design costs should be considered soft costs or part of the overall exhibit budget. I personally think they should be soft costs, not part of your exhibit budget. It's like the line item for architect's fees. Those are soft costs. Who are all these soft cost people and why do they cost so much? We get that list sometimes too. There really are a long list of specialty consultants that people get excited about, but depending on the scope of your project, it can be a pretty long list. Clients sometimes look at the soft cost fees with hourly rates and ask why they're more expensive than your typical staff person. It's because wrapped up in their fees are their own overhead, benefits, administrative costs for that company. And they have years of expertise, so should be very efficient and end up saving you money in the long run. These are project-based contracts with a specific scope of work, specific duration, and that's very common in the industry. So for those of you who have been waiting through this long, boring presentation for the specific cost
Drum roll,
information,
Kris.
sorry for burying the lead. The seminar is about process, not to tell you the answers. Also, this is just average data. Your project is not average. This needs sampling and you have specific needs. So what we're seeing in the sampling is that exhibit costs are averaging about $1,000 a square foot for usable exhibit areas only. That's not over the whole building, it's just the exhibit areas. These costs include media production, which is averaging about 15 to 20% of the exhibit budget, sometimes more, depending on the designer. Sometimes you might have 30 or 40% just for media production because it's so tech heavy. The other thing is this is just for experience museums like history museums, science museums. This is not art museums and not children's museums. Now, new construction for these types of museums are about $1,100 a square foot for the whole building. It's the gross square feet, excluding the site improvements. So site improvements vary depending on the site, so we took that out of the analysis. So site improvements, utilities, parking, landscaping, this is just the building, $1,100 a square foot. It's a lot of money, but as you can see from the previous slide where we talked about escalation and inflation, it is what it is. Soft costs averaged about 17% of the total project costs, and the owner's contingency when they started out the project averaged about 10% of the hard costs. Owners typically will start out with 10% contingency at the beginning and utilize a cushion like we talked about. Now, We did sample, just the fine print, we sampled relevant new construction projects that were bid or complete in the last 3 years. Again, we excluded art museums and children museums. And as you can see from previous slides, the cumulative inflation coming out of COVID has been a barrier to entry for a lot of owners, with exhibit fabrication and costs for the building hovering each around $1,000 a square foot or more. This information is not specific to any project or client, and we agreed to keep this data confidential so others can really see this real life experience and real life data. So I'm just going to do a quick example here using the data. If we were to build a 30,000 square foot museum and 8,000 square feet of exhibit space, here's the back of the napkin calculation using the unit rates. Again, this excludes site improvements, parking, utilities, service connections, FF&E. If you're looking at roughly about $54 million as a starting point for a 30,000 square foot museum.
So, exhibit fabrication. What is the market report? In 2025, as Kris mentioned, we expect inflation to be about 5%. This is a best guess. We just got out of first quarter. This could change depending on the specific market sectors. So we're not anticipating high COVID levels of inflation, but it certainly will be more than typical. So as we know, everything can change in a moment. We're still tracking tariffs, and with tariffs on hold for 90 days, we're not sure what to expect. Updated tariffs will more heavily impact raw materials than finished goods at the moment. And so we know that the tariffs might impact things, and we don't know how they might impact things like educational products. This is still an unknown. The good news is we can be proactive. So when considering materials purchases, I know we're specifically looking for like US sources of wood and metal when possible. As you think back to the slide with the different types of commodity goods, things like shop hardware, off the charts. How can we source certain things more locally to be able to mitigate the cost increases? We don't know what will happen with AV hardware yet. We're still following the market, same with lighting hardware. But systems designers can look at where products they're specifying are manufactured. As we know, there's a target on China right now. So where can we look at hardware from Japan, Korea, or Taiwan as potential alternatives for things that can't be sourced in the US? So keep in mind, materials specifically from outside of the US are different. Solid surface, laminate, even powder coat colors are not the same. So these products are designed to fit the tastes of each local market. So when you're thinking about ordering things overseas, there's also a longer lead time, and things can be impacted by risk, such as shipping. So looking at the US versus the world, considering where we can look at potential US sourcing is hopefully going to help us mitigate costs. So then as we learn more, we'll be able to assess options for value engineering. But again, right now we're looking at possible substitutions for a lot of areas.
Great. So we're not going to talk much about this summary slide. We're running a little bit over. There's been a lot of information today. But you can see on the screen here, this is a summary of kind of all the topics. And I think we'd like to open it up for questions at this time.
Yes, thank you. So I've been monitoring some questions that have come in. I want to start with two questions that are in the same ballpark of topic. It's about the cost per square foot. And one was, does the 1,000 square feet include science centers? And the other one was, why did you exclude children's museums? So we talked about this in our group. So whichever one of you guys want to take that on.
Well, for exhibits, why don't you talk, Cathlin, because that's your bailiwick.
Sure. So yes, we would say science centers falls under this category. Most of them are fairly tech heavy. So tech heavy exhibits are going to fall under that $1,000-ish per square foot. Children's museums, they're a bit of a different animal, and we track those. We track every type of museum that we're building and the cost per square foot. And they're typically lower tech. While there are a lot of hands-on mechanical interactives, there are no showcases. There are certain elements of like a natural history museum that are excluded from children's museums. So the price per square foot you're going to see for children's museum is significantly lower. So you're looking at more like $250 to $500 a square foot for fabrication. So that's why that data was excluded, because it would skew the overall results to not reflect more of an adult experience museum that's going to be artifact driven.
Thanks. And following up on also just one of your slides, can you talk, Cathlin, more about the escalation costs on shop hardware that was shown on your inflation slide? What do you know? Can you talk about what you think the reason behind this is?
You know, the greatest inflation we saw for shop hardware was immediately in 2021. So what's happening is it's still persisting where others, I mean, it skyrocketed. It almost doubled between 2020 and 2021. I think it has something to do with manufacturing. A lot of shop hardware, and this is just nuts and bolts, is coming from overseas. So things that are coming from certain regions overseas have just been very expensive. And if there's still demand and demand is exceeding supply, prices stay high.
Thank you. There's a question that says the majority of your analysis seems based on the cost of materials, but salary and freelancer rate is a significant cost, and inflation generally tends to produce a cost wage spiral. Have you looked at the effects of inflation on salary costs? If so, what's the impact? I can take that one.
Please do.
You can. Did you get a 44% raise in the last 5 years, Carolynne?
I didn't.
It's a great question.
So when creating a target budget, to Krista's very detailed spreadsheet, and this also goes to, I'm going to also note another question that came in that said how to deal with a particular NARA request for exhibit and design costs for things like a presidential library. I've worked in that environment as well. When you're doing your target budget, you look at your landscape. And if you're going to have, and also every client museum, they charge back salaries sometimes. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't to the project. So you look and see what are my staff resources? What are my, contractor resources? And so you go into those line items and you pump them up if you think, you're not going to get charged back for salaries, staff costs, but you are going to have to bring in a whole bunch of different, let's say you don't have a curatorial staff and you need to bring in 25 subject matter experts. That line item is going to be a hefty line item that, someone like me might have to defend to a board, but it's because that, you have to do your target budget based on your landscape. So if you're dealing when you have to deal with the National Archives and you're going to have more restrictive materials in your cases, you're going to have active control of humidity. Those fabrication costs need to be loaded in there. You need to have a higher percentage of fabrication costs. So to the point of this whole webinar, you don't want to get caught not having loaded in those costs from the target budget stage, because then you're going to have to cannibalize other parts of your project in order to pay for them.
Yeah, and another thing with labor that the initial big cost impacts happen during COVID, where there were a lot of layoffs, frankly, across the world during COVID. And then after COVID, projects are happening, teams are needing human resources. Hiring people back is more expensive. So we've certainly seen an increase in labor costs. I think, Kris, maybe that's a separate webinar digging into that data, yeah. But that is certainly something that's impacting overall project costs.
Right. And overhead things like insurance and benefits, like those things have certainly increased to companies that provide services as well. And also soft costs, if you're a new museum, 3 people working out of their house and putting a new building together, a lot of our clients in that situation might add in $500,000 for marketing and advertising before they open. That money's got to come from somewhere. So I think really thinking about where you're going to, include money for the capital project and line that up with their operating budget is really important.
There's a clarifying question. Is that $1,000 a square foot amount of exhibitions the hard costs only, meaning the cost of designing those exhibitions is accounted for in the soft cost category?
So those are costs, they do not include exhibit design. What it did include is hiring a fabricator and all their associated costs, lighting, AV, and media production. So sometimes people think media production is a soft cost. We tend to think it's carry it in the exhibit cost category. So media is included in that $1,000 per square foot average. Again, it's an average. There were some that were more, some were less.
Yeah, a good way to think about it, Kris, is maybe, things that end up on the exhibit floor are your hard costs. So because that media is something that visitors interact with on your floor, that's why it's in that category.
Agree.
Yes, that's a good way to put it. So there are a couple of questions that are talking about tariffs and kind of navigating that. I think you guys did talk about where we are with that. We all are dealing with issues of things that are going back and forth before final assembly,
Mhm.
things that may have components from different locations. I think we're in just a little bit of a time of uncertainty, but if you could just mention what you mentioned before about how you're navigating that right now.
Yeah, so on the front end during an estimate or where we're procuring different materials, we're trying to look at where things are sourced, where we can avoid, reduce, mitigate tariffs. So I know wood products is something where we're going to see heavy tariffs in the US from products coming from Canada. That's something that we are on the lookout for. A lot of metals are coming out of China. So where we can source from the US, we're going to hopefully be able to reduce costs. But again, we don't know what's going to happen in the next 90 days. We're continuing to track it. We're going to continue to collect data on that. So please, if you have specific questions, don't hesitate to reach out. But that may be a webinar in itself, how to deal with tariffs.
Yeah, and
Well,
I'll say from a standpoint of managing, museum projects, both from the construction and the hiring exhibitors, we're really timing those things, trying to look at the political landscape. And like next year, looks like it's going to be a more settled down year because it's an election year. So like we have a large construction project going on right now. On the construction side, the timing was good because basically in 2024, we locked down the general contractor on a guaranteed maximum price. We saw the writing on the wall in November with the election that we're going to have a little bit of uncertainty in the marketplace, and we worked hard to, release orders, make down payments, get subcontractors tied up, and contracted down to get those things released and in the states and in their hands of possession. That way, you're kind of mitigating the risk there. Similar with AV hardware, if we're going to release a fabricator this year, we're considering methods of maybe locking down the hardware only later on when we need it, not now, because this year it's like it's insane. So I
Yeah,
think
and the
also, I would
same front with hardware, something that we've been trying to do is, purchase lighting AV hardware early. So we're getting in before tariffs, for instance. But then, you have the issue of warranty. You don't want something to run out of warranty. So we've been negotiating with suppliers to extend that warranty to begin at the museum substantial completion rather than the receipt date.
Yeah, that's a great point. I would just add back to the target budget. We are now putting in escalation year over year in the target budget. So I
Yeah,
think,
we are too.
yes, thank you for that slide. So we're out of time. We had a couple of questions we didn't get to. Here is our contact information. You can also, again, find us at the praxisexhibits.com. Happy to share additional information. Sorry we didn't get to all your questions. There were a couple in there about fundraising and dealing with escalation and also pro formas. So
oh, that
please
was a good
don't.
one.
Well, and I'll say, I know we were talking about this as we were developing this webinar is, okay, the next question is going to be fundraising. So you are right in line with us, and we are working on a webinar with some professional fundraisers because we all know this is going to be part of moving forward, how we bring in those outside professionals to help us.
We're also working on a webinar on earned revenue
Mm.
to given the landscape right now as well with grants and other funding. So stay tuned to your next Praxis Museum Projects Group webinar, and thank you for joining us today.